Tick-tock, time to rock. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's watching from all over the planet. I am your friendly neighborhood philosopher, D. Wood. With me now is, I have to say, the most useless man in the world because he reports on Jihad, and Jihad has been over for a long, long time.
It's an interior spiritual struggle, David. So I have news this week about people praying and giving alms. It's a beautiful thing, really.
Well, Robert, how does it feel to be so useless to humanity? That
David. It's an interesting question you've asked because, unfortunately, while we all know that Islam is a religion of peace and that jihad refers to the interior struggle within the soul to better oneself and to be more pleasing to Allah, at the same time there is an unfortunate recurring problem of Muslims who misunderstand Islam and fail to realize that jihad is entirely peaceful. And unfortunately, there is a great deal to report about their activities this week all around the world.
Yeah, no matter how many times we say that Islam is a religion of peace, and no matter how clearly politicians and journalists and educators and entertainers, I mean everyone, Hollywood, everyone, no matter how many times everyone in the world in a unified voice proclaims that Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance, these misunderstanders of Islam just keep getting the wrong idea, no matter what we do.
It is amazing because the unanimity is striking. Every last politician in the West, every last non-Muslim authority, from the Pope to John Kerry to Joe Biden to Hillary Clinton, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, Angela Merkel, you can just go down the line. And every last one of them knows full well that Islam teaches peace, tolerance is an entirely benign and beneficial for the human spirit. So why it is that some Muslims who ought to know their holy book better than these great experts on Islam, somehow they get this idea that it has nothing, that it teaches violence and warfare against unbelievers. It's an enduring mystery.
It's one of life's great mysteries.
Yes.
Yeah, it's and there's no way of getting to the bottom of it, because if we wanted to get to the bottom of it, we'd have to go to Islam's most trusted sources and see what they say, and we're just not allowed to do that. That's off limits. Only bigots and Islamophobes and racists would ever think of doing something like that. All right, so we said last week that there probably wouldn't be any news in Jihad from then up until now, so I'm assuming that you're staring in front of you at a blank screen, or if there is anything on the screen, it is just, you know, people trying to work out this inner struggle to stay in shape, and that's the only form of jihad that you have to report, I'm guessing.
Well, David, unfortunately, there is a bit of misunderstanding here and there.
Darn misunderstanders of Islam keep messing up our show.
It's a shame. It really is a shame.
They never cooperate.
Uganda, we can start with today. A Muslim woman converted to Christianity, and her husband found out about it. And instead of congratulating her on exercising her free conscience and demonstrating the tolerance of Islam, he beat her with a stick. And it looked as if he was going to kill her outright. Except she fled first. Interestingly enough, also in Uganda this week, there was a man who converted to Christianity, and a group of Muslims found out about his conversion to Christianity. And oddly enough, David, they decided to meet in the local mosque to discuss what to do about this. And what they did after they met in the mosque was go to his home and start chanting his name in a menacing manner outside the house. And then they broke into the house. He had already fled, so there was nobody there. But they broke into the house wielding machetes, sticks, and stones. He was able to survive because, as I say, he had fled the area already. But here we have several interesting aspects of these stories. One is that converts to Christianity from Islam being done violence to by the Muslims of their acquaintance, which is odd since we all know that Islam teaches tolerance. And the fact that the people who broke into this gentleman's house with machetes, sticks, and stones, they had met in the mosque to plot out doing this. And of course, we all know that a mosque is just like a church or a synagogue. It's an entirely peaceful place. As a matter of fact, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, which is an organization that has actually been at all.
1 second. Back to Uganda.
Yes, sir.
One, I had a correction. You said that Muslims did this. It was misunderstanders of Islam who did that.
Yeah,
so
right.
in both cases. But I just wanted.
But they weren't.
Yeah, and I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the fact that, I mean, because a lot of people aren't familiar with the situation in various African countries, but Uganda is not a Muslim country. That is a majority Christian country. It's like 13 to 15% of the population is Muslim, and you're already in serious danger of your life for leaving Islam.
There are three stories out of Uganda of converts from Islam being brutalized and beaten or even killed by their Muslim acquaintances.
Yeah, and you know, we've been saying for years that the situation kind of changes depending on the percentage of Muslims and the status of Muslims in a society, and that's because that's the pattern laid down by Muhammad. When Muhammad was completely outnumbered in Mecca, couldn't have hoped to win a confrontation with the unbelievers. That's where you get these passages, to you be your religion and to me be my religion, and so on. Later, once he had formed various alliances, then you start getting passages which call for a kind of defensive jihad, meaning other people have to do something to you first, even if they're just criticizing your religion. That counts as your violent retaliation counts as defensive jihad. But even that was in the end. Once they became the most powerful force, once they became the most powerful force in Arabia, then the rules changed to fight those who do not believe in Allah. The rules kept changing based on how powerful Muslims were in the society. And we look today, a place like the United States, 1% of the population Muslim. What is Islam? Everyone agrees, peace and tolerance. You look at places like Saudi Arabia or Pakistan. If you're not a Muslim, you are a second-class citizen. And then you've got the places in the middle where it seems like once they start reaching 9 or 10%, then you start getting into more of a defensive jihad situation, but it's not what we think of as defense. It's not, hey, an army is marching against you and therefore you can defend yourself. It's any perceived threat against Islam, any perceived danger to Islam can be met with violence, and that would include people leaving Islam. And then you get the violent retaliation. So we're not talking about Muslim countries in Africa. We're talking about Christian majority countries in Africa, and they're already experiencing Sharia. And so,
indeed. And the other aspect of this, as I noted, was that the meeting that preceded the threatening of this one convert came in a mosque. And that was why I mentioned this France story, because Marwan Mohammed, the former executive director of the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, he has protested against new plans by the French government to conduct surveillance in mosques. And he says that these are inherently racist and bigoted plans because churches and synagogues are not going to be placed under similar surveillance. And yet this leads us to the inevitable problem that you see invariably stories about weapons being stockpiled in mosques. You never see that in churches or synagogues or Hindu temples. You don't see the same kind of plotting of violence or people coming out of prayers and doing violence or rioting that we see so many times when it comes to mosques. And this Uganda story is another example of it. And so it's entirely justified for the French government to think they should place special surveillance on mosques that they don't need to place on churches and synagogues. If you start seeing terrorist plotting in churches and synagogues, then put the surveillance there as well. But otherwise, it's just politically correct posturing.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking because we've talked in past weeks about New York City because I lived in the Bronx for a long time, and I counted how many terrorist attacks had been foiled by the government in New York. So how many attacks that were actually really close to home for me had been foiled, and it was something like 12 in a row. But if you look at how many of those terrorist attacks were foiled, it's because there were informants in the mosque. It's because the mosques had informants in them. And someone's walking around looking for bomb parts, and he's talking to various people. Hey, where can I get this? Where can I get that? He's talking about where to get things for an attack, and ends up talking to an informant. And so, I mean, I am not a big fan of government surveillance and things like that. But I mean, if you keep catching people in the same kinds of locations, and keep in mind, these. As stupid as we think the governments are, and as stupid as many politicians are, the people who are actually doing the work are often very, very intelligent. They wouldn't have gotten to those positions. And they understand the difference between nice, friendly Muslims over in that mosque who aren't trying to kill anyone and so on, and this mosque which keeps somehow producing jihadis, right? They understand that. And so they understand, oh, hey, maybe we want some eyes on that mosque over there, and not so much on these guys over here, where no jihadis are coming from, but jihadis keep coming from over here. So maybe we need some eyes on the eyes in there. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, whenever this kind of discussion is had, then the same old Islamophobia charges come up. And you have the people in the jihadi mosque in particular generally saying this kind of surveillance is racist, bigoted in itself, and thus to be discouraged and has no justification. Okay.
Yeah, by the way, on that, I have to say, no, I'm completely fair on this. If there were a church and terrorists kept coming out of that church, and you said, "Hey, I want to go have some eyes on that church," go for it. You go for it.
If I were in that church, I'd call the feds.
Yeah, same thing with a synagogue, same thing with a Hindu temple. If you keep noticing a pattern. Then there's probably a reason for the pattern. That's all I'm saying.
Exactly. Okay, well, we're just finishing up with the Christmas season and all that, and so I've got a few Christmas stories here. After an evening of Christmas caroling in Nigeria, a couple of Christians were driving home and were ambushed by some jihadis and murdered. That was in Nigeria in, let's see, Fulani militants did it. They are, of course, jihadis who have apparently decided that they're going to try to drive the Christians out of various areas and take control of them, the territory that the Christians occupy. This took place in Plateau State. That's what I was looking for. But really, there's pretty much every Nigerian state there's jihad activity nowadays.
And Robert.
Yes, sir.
I didn't hear one word about that attack. But do you think if it had been Muslims who were attacked, who were the victims of the crime, and they were coming home from, celebrating Ramadan or something like that, and they were attacked by Christians who were trying to subjugate them, do you think we would have heard of that?
It would be perhaps the biggest story of the new year.
And you and I would be blamed.
Oh, yeah, that's certainly true. Absolutely. But unfortunately, you're right. And there's so many stories like this, David. After a New Year's prayer meeting, also in Nigeria, and let me look for the state again here. It was, this was in the Irigwe chiefdom, the Middle Belt in central Nigeria. There was a New Year's prayer meeting, and a Christian was on his way home from that and was burned to death beyond recognition, again by jihadis, and then they boasted that this was the first attack of the new year and that many more would be coming soon. Then also we had in Borno State another jihad attack. This is also in Nigeria, when Jihadis stormed a predominantly Christian community, Wultihia, and burned down the church, burned some houses down, and destroyed a couple of cars. This was an entirely unprovoked attack, with the villagers fleeing into the forest and being shot at by the jihadis as they fled.
And by the way, I don't think most people in the West understand how important certain places like Nigeria are, because Islam has, been trying to expand for 14 centuries. And then you got certain places that are like the dividing line, where you have Muslims on one side and mostly non-Muslims on the other. And so you could go over to, India and stuff like that. You could have one area that's mostly Muslims, and then you go south and it's mostly non-Muslims. Well, Nigeria is one of those places, right?
Yes, indeed.
Sorry, I have a cold.
Sorry to hear.
Anyway, Nigeria is one of those places where it's kind of a dividing line. And Muslims are constantly trying to, misunderstanders of Islam are constantly trying to push that line further, right? They want to advance, right? They want to push. In other words, this is the Muslim world. They want it to keep expanding and so on. And a place like Nigeria, there's one of the dividing lines as far as mostly Muslims on one side, mostly non-Muslims on the other side. And those are always massive targets for jihad activity, because they're trying to weaken up the lines, push further, and they're not in any terrible rush. The main strategy is just being completely relentless. Just keep pushing. May take 50 years, may take 100, may take 200, but pretty soon the next generation, third generation, fourth generation, they've got it, and the line is much further along. And so, guys, don't forget how important some of these other places are.
That's the lesson of the history of jihad. That in 1400 years, you have a very patient fighting force that continues to advance, and anytime it's set back, it just keeps on trying. And there may be 100 years, 200 years, 300 years where the non-Muslims are strong and the jihadis are weak, and consequently they can't advance, but it never ends. It never stops. There's never been a reform or a correction or a reformation, reconsideration of the jihad passages in the Quran and Sunnah, and consequently the conflict just keeps going. This is something that I think most Americans have no idea of. And we tend to think, well, there was World War I and it was 4 years, and World War II it was 4 years for us and 6 years for everybody else, and that's it. And there's wars that start and wars that end. The idea of a war that's gone on for 1400 years and has never ended, that just is absolutely out of the question. It's not even considered. So we had General Petraeus in Afghanistan a few years back saying this war could go on for another 5 or 10 years. And I just couldn't believe it. When I read that, I thought, did he really think that he's going to end the jihad in Afghanistan in 5 or 10 years? He may be able to contain it for a while, but obviously we saw how all that worked out. It never ended, and they were never able to end it. They don't understand what it's all about fundamentally, and that's one of the reasons why they keep making so many mistakes.
Now, was that the same Petraeus who kept calling the Quran the Holy Quran? And
oh yeah,
insisting that the Quran be handled respectfully, but
yes.
Meanwhile they were burning Bibles.
Yep.
Guys, you remember that? I made a video on that years ago where the U.S. military people were trying to send Bibles to Afghanistan, right? And say, hey, here's Bibles, and the U.S. military didn't want to cause any. They didn't want the idea to spread that, hey, we're trying to spread Christianity here. So they ordered the Bibles to be burned when they were packages of Bibles to be burned when they were getting to Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the regulations for places like Gitmo and so on for handling Qurans came down, and you have to carefully put on these white gloves and so on to inspect the Quran and handle with the utmost care. Meanwhile, Bibles are garbage that you burn and so on. And so you're telling me that guy, he had some wrong ideas about jihad? This is so strange.
He thought it was going to He thought it was going to be a long war, and it was. But he actually thought that it was going to end with an American victory based on the end of Jihad. I mean, he just obviously never had a clue as to what he was dealing with.
Well, by the way, that's when people really seem to think, like when you had the Arab Spring, that's when people really seem to think that, yeah, you have some violent radicals and so on, but it's just because people feel disrespected. Once you shower them with praise and tell them how much you love their religion and respect their book, then their hearts are going to melt and they're going to come over to your side. And they really seem to believe that. And then you had that throughout the Obama administration, and all it led to was like ISIS and so on. It's like they smelled weakness in the water, and then things got much worse. And so, and that kind of shook people out of that, because I don't hear that a lot anymore. I don't hear a lot of, they just feel disrespected. And if you just show them some respect, then they'll love you. I don't hear that anymore. Whereas 15 years ago, I heard that all the time. They've been massively disrespected by the West, and that's why they're so mad at you.
Another thing that I used to hear 15, 20 years ago all the time, and never hear it ever anymore, and that is Turkey is the model for the Islamic world. And in 20, 30, 50 years, we're going to have 5 or 10 more Turkeys. And after a while, the whole place will be a Western-style secular democracy. And of course, nobody says that anymore, because Turkey has gone exactly the opposite direction and is readopting Sharia and Islamizing at a rapid clip. And so nobody sees it as a model for the Islamic world at all.
Turkey. Gotta love Turkey. And you know what? Even 15 years ago, I used to hear lovely things about Pakistan all the time, and about how great Christian Muslim relations were in Pakistan.
Speaking of Turkey, I got another New Year's Day story. On New Year's Day, a church in Istanbul, some friends of the church there scrawled Allah one on the door of the church. That is the numeral 1, meaning obviously a reference to Tawheed, the radical monotheism of Islam. They were refuting or denying the Trinity that was taught and worshipped in this church. And so this was yet another sign of the tolerance and welcoming nature that we hear so much about in terms of religious minorities in the Islamic world.
Now, I didn't hear anything about that, Robert, but if someone were to, if someone had spray painted something about Allah on a mosque, or something about Jesus on a mosque in Canada or the U.S., do you think we might have heard of that?
I think we would be forced to hear of that. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And even like 20 years later, we'd be hearing about it, right? When we say, what about the intolerance that we read about in the Quran? Well, you're talking about that. What about someone who spray painted Jesus on that mosque all those years ago? Well, you're not answering that.
And yet you're right, David, because these things are actually far more common than that. And another story I had this week is out of Bangladesh, where 3 Hindu temples were desecrated by Muslims hanging raw beef on their doors. And of course, the cow is sacred in Hinduism, so this was a grave insult and a desecration of these 3 Hindu temples by people belonging to the majority religion in the country. What's interesting to note about that also is that right next door in India, a Muslim group has gone to the Indian Supreme Court to criminalize insults to Muhammad. And so it's kind of ironic that some Muslims in Turkey and Bangladesh this week, and of course there are many, many other stories like this from all over the world, but just this week there are 2 incidents of people being intolerant toward non-Muslims and being insulting to their religions. And nobody in Bangladesh or in Turkey is going to go to the courts and try to ask for protection for the religious minorities. They would know that would be useless exercise anyway. But in India, where mosques are not being attacked, you have this kind of action by the Muslims because some people have said things critical of Islam. Incidentally, one of those people was Wasim Rizvi, who was a Muslim leader who noted that there were violent passages in the Quran and called for reform. and was threatened and told he was not a Muslim, and he left Islam and embraced Hinduism. And this is the kind of insult that they're talking about, because he spoke about the violence in the texts and teachings of Islam as he was converting.
So people are, some misunderstanders are hanging beef as an insult to Hindus. I only heard about that right here from you. But I suspect...
It's a big story, but only in Bangladesh.
But I suspect that if someone had put pork on a mosque or something like that, that I would have heard about it over and over again. Endlessly.
No doubt about that.
All week long.
Yes, and there would have been commissions and studies about Islamophobia in the United States and what we can possibly do about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, shall we go to Afghanistan, David?
What could be happening in Afghanistan?
The Taliban.
No. The Taliban took over. So now you're now. I mean, everyone withdrew. So now you're going to get peace.
Right. You're not only going to get peace, you're going to get Islam, because that's what the Taliban is all about. In the West, people like to say that the Taliban is misunderstanding Islam and has nothing to do with the real Islam. But if you read what the Taliban says, everything they do is very carefully based upon Islamic teachings. And so this week, the Taliban have sentenced a television to death, which is obviously a symbolic move designed to express disapproval with what is on the television, and smashed musical instruments as being forbidden in Islam, dumped 3,000 liters of alcohol into a canal in Kabul. And I think, well, that's so much alcohol in that canal. You could probably just get a cup, you know. And
the world's biggest punch bowl.
Exactly. But the biggest story out of Afghanistan this week, of course, as you know, is the great beheading of the mannequins.
Yeah.
Mannequins, department store mannequins, were ruled idols. Now, David, I've been in a lot of department stores in many years, in many places, even in Europe, not just in the United States, in Australia, and I have never once seen anybody worshiping a department store mannequin. I have never been moved to idolatry by a department store mannequin. But nonetheless, the Taliban thought this was such a pressing concern, and obviously what's much more likely is that they didn't like that these mannequins were being used or could be used to model Western fashions and not just a burqa. So that's a
double whammy there.
Yeah, that's right. And there are actual videos of the mannequins being actually physically beheaded. Now this, of course, will destroy their power as idols. As you go, actually, you know, it's interesting. If you go to any museum, David, any museum of ancient history, any place in the ancient world where Islam was once present or is still present, you will see many statues or Byzantine icons, all kinds of artwork with the eyes gouged out and the nose knocked off. The Sphinx is one notable example. And this is because if you remove the eyes and the nose, then it's no longer a human image, an image of a human being, and thus it's no longer an idol. And you know, this has been obscured to a tremendous degree. It's a common story that a lot of people take for granted, that Napoleon's troops in Egypt shot the nose off the Sphinx doing target practice. This is actually false. It was actually removed after a fatwa declaring it was an idol, and the nose was knocked off by believing pious Muslims who thought that they wanted to prevent this thing from being worshipped.
Well, I mean, you know, because it's confusing to us to think that, you know, you've got all these things around you and you might start bowing down and worshiping them. But, I mean, if you have a group of people who are really used to bowing down to a giant, you know, Borg cube, and they just can't stop bowing down to this Borg cube and walking circles around it and taking pilgrimages to it. And then you've got, even more, you've got this black stone on the side that's been broken to pieces, and people running up and kissing it and kissing it and kissing it and kissing it. And so it's you know, I walk down the street. If I see a cube, I don't feel a need to bow down to it. If I see a rock, I don't start smooching it. But For people who do, they might be worried. Wait, we bow down to just a cube and we kiss a rock. What if something has a face on it? That's like even more tempting. So
that's irresistible. So they got
kryptonite.
That's it. I mean, you just have to knock the face off of a thing like that. It's just too dangerous. Okay, do you remember Awad al-Suwaymin? Awad al-Suwaymin was an Iraqi migrant in Liverpool who got into a taxi and asked the taxi to take him to the Anglican Cathedral. And the traffic was too bad. I believe it was Remembrance Day. And the taxi driver then was told by this Awad al-Suwaymin to take him to the Liverpool Women's Hospital. Anyway, at a certain point, out in front of the hospital, the taxi driver noticed that he was wearing a suicide vest. And he blew himself up. I believe we actually discussed this some weeks ago. He blew himself up in the cab. The taxi driver was in the cab during the explosion but was able to escape with his life. Now, Awad al-Suwaymin, it was widely reported after he did this that this was a Christian, that he had converted to Christianity. There was photographic evidence of him standing with the bishop in Liverpool's cathedral. He was a Christian. And a lot of Muslims were very happy about this on Twitter and taunting, saying, you see, you have Christian suicide bombers and you blame Islam and so on. But since then, it has come out that his Christianity, his conversion to Christianity was entirely deceptive and meant to gain him the sympathy of British officials, because he's applying for asylum and he's going to say that he faces death as a Christian convert if he goes home to Iraq because of the death penalty in Islam for apostasy. So they have to let him stay there. He was not actually a genuine Christian. He had a Quran, he had a prayer mat, and it has been reported that he was frequenting the mosque on a daily basis in the days and weeks before the suicide mission. And so, of course, the suicide attack comes from the Quran, chapter 9, verse 111, promising paradise to those who kill and are killed for Allah. And the conversion to Christianity is an example of someone putting into practice Muhammad's dictum, war is deceit. And he considers that the Islamic world as the Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, is at war with the Dar al-Harb, the house of war, and that any time then that you can deceive the unbelievers in order to gain something from them, gain an advantage over them, you're justified in doing so. And so all the people who claimed that he was a Christian and actually took comfort in that by thinking that it reinforced their moral equivalence of Christianity with Islam, they have been definitively shown to be relying on false information.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time people fell for false information.
Ain't that the truth? All right, we have, yes, sir.
Oh, go ahead.
There's so much more. Let's see.
I've got a story from Germany.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I talked about this on my channel. So this is from the Associated Press. German prosecutors said Tuesday they have charged 2 Afghan brothers with murder over the July killing of their sister, whom they allegedly wanted to punish for her Western way of life. The men, aged 26 and 22, and identified only as Syed H. and Sayed H., in line with German privacy rules, they don't want to name them, are accused of luring their 34-year-old sister to a meeting in Berlin on July 13th, then choking and strangling her and cutting her throat. Prosecutors in the capital charged that they took a taxi to a station later that day with her body in a suitcase, then traveled to Bavaria by train and drove to a site near the elder brother's home where they buried her. The indictment states that the men wanted to punish their sister for her Western-oriented way of life, which did not correspond to their archaic ideas of honor and morals and their image of women, prosecutors said in a statement. So these guys lured their sister to a meeting, choked her, strangled her, cut her throat, chopped up her body, put the body parts in a suitcase, took a taxi to the train station, then took a train to Bavaria, where the elder brother's home was, and then they buried her. And so, Robert, have you heard of these? Have you heard of these things called honor killings? Have you heard of those?
Why, David? Yes, I have. Unfortunately, it is a recurring phenomenon in many areas of the Islamic world. And there are many Muslim countries that actually, as a matter of law, not all of them, but some of them, actually have a more lenient sentence prescribed if you can prove that you committed murder as an honor killing than if it were just an ordinary murder. And so this is a practice that is widely accepted. It is based ultimately on the Quran itself, in a very strange passage in chapter 18 of the Quran, where Moses, the prophet, he approaches a mysterious and unnamed figure who is called Khidr, or green, in the Islamic tradition. And he asks him if he can follow him. He says, "May I follow you?" This is chapter 18, verse 66. Moses said to him, "May I follow you so that you might teach me right conduct from what you have been taught?" And so they follows him, and the fellow does these strange things. And in verse 74, chapter 18, verse 74 of the Quran, it says, "So the two journeyed on until when they met a boy, he killed him." That is, Khidr killed him. And Moses is appalled. Moses said, "What? Have you killed an innocent soul who has not killed any man? Indeed, you have done a horrid thing." And so finally, at length, the mysterious figure explains to Moses why he did all these strange things. And in the course of this, he explains why he killed the boy. And he says, "As for the boy," this is chapter 18, verse 80, "his parents were believers, and we were afraid that he would oppress them by rebellion and disbelief. And we intended that their Lord would exchange him for them for one better, in purity and nearer to mercy." So they're saying, it says, if you that Khidr kills this boy because he knows he's going to grow up to be an unbeliever and grieve his pious parents. And so if you have pious parents now, you have a Quranic example of what you should do with a child who is grieving the parents by acting in an un-Islamic manner.
And it's interesting, Robert, that, I mean, this entire family left Afghanistan to move to Germany. They wanted to get out of Afghanistan. So they moved. I mean, she was killed in July, so they moved before that. So they got out well in advance of the Taliban takeover, but maybe they saw the writing on the wall there. But they got out of there. They didn't want to be governed by the Taliban, apparently. That's what you'd expect if they're moving from Afghanistan to Germany, and yet they want to live by the same rules as the Taliban. Wild stuff.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately, it's probably also another Quranic passage that illustrates that illustrates what's going on with such people who leave a place where there is strict Sharia and then bring Sharia with them to their new home where they would not have to live under it should they choose not to. And that is chapter 4, verse 100 of the Quran, which is coming right up on my screen here. It is, "Whoever emigrates for the sake of Allah will find much refuge and abundance in the earth, and whoever forsakes his home as a refugee for Allah and his messenger, and death overtakes him, his reward is then obligatory upon Allah." Now that's big. If your reward is obligatory upon Allah, there are very few passages in the Quran. There's 9:111 that I quoted earlier that Allah promises paradise to those who kill and are killed. But this is, he's guaranteed to give you a reward if you emigrate in his cause. And that means that you're not just moving to another country, but you're moving to another country to bring Islam to it. Mm-hmm. And so that's likely what they had, that kind of thing is what they had in mind.
Meanwhile, the sister just wanted to be out from under the control of Taliban-like figures, but it was her own brothers.
Indeed.
Killed her. Perhaps the most interesting part of that article was that German prosecutors called the brothers' views archaic, when it's pretty standard in Afghanistan and Pakistan and so on. And so, I mean, gosh, they called Islamic values archaic.
How Islamophobic, Dave.
That's
inexcusably Islamophobic.
Yeah, I mean, that should be the real story here. The real story should be German prosecutors arrested for Islamophobia, disbarred permanently, sentenced to 50 years in prison for Islamophobia.
It's coming. It's coming. Chancellor Scholz, who is now the Chancellor of Germany, he knows nothing. And he is a Marxist who is not at all interested in the freedom of speech. So I expect that we're going to see quite a lot of that coming. But in any case, let's go to Pakistan, David. Pakistan is always a delightful place for jihadis, and kind of an interesting story this week. There was a Muslim who was drinking a 7-Up, an American soft drink, in a can.
Yeah.
And he was apparently looking at the can, and he noticed that in that UPC code, is it called, the little square that you can scan for the price? It's just a lot of gobbledygook. It doesn't look like anything. The QR code, the QR code. He noticed that the name of Muhammad was written in the QR code.
So is that a miracle?
No, because it's man-made. See, that's exactly the point. If it was a fish and the scales spelled a lot, that's a miracle. But if it's a 7-Up can, it's blasphemy, because some man manufactured that. And so he threatened to burn the Pepsi delivery truck that had pulled up with all this Pepsi and 7-Up and so on in it.
Well, that's good.
But you hit the nail right on the head. That's
watch out for those barcodes.
Yes, we see miracles all the time. Islamic apologists claiming that the name of Allah is written in this or that, on a loaf of bread, in a fish, wherever, on a tree. But if a human being writes it, then it's blasphemy. And so presumably, even if an image of Muhammad were to suddenly appear on a rock, then that would be a miracle. And that would not be blasphemy. But you have an image of Muhammad on a 7-Up can, watch out. We have a case of discrimination and Islamophobia right here in the United States, David. I'm sorry, deeply sorrowful to say. And that came out of Missouri. Actually, did we discuss this last week? We might have discussed this last week, because this was a little early in the week. Did we talk about CARE suing the gun range for the hijab-wearing person not allowed to shoot? I think we did.
Go ahead and run it down just in case.
Yeah, Frontier Justice, a gun store in the Kansas City area. They wouldn't let a woman wearing a hijab fire a gun. Excuse me.
I know everyone's sick.
Yep. They wouldn't let her fire a gun on their gun range because they said that her hijab would catch could possibly catch fire from some of the lead fragments and so on.
Which it can.
And that they have a ban on all headgear as a result of that. It's not just hijabs that they ban. But of course, the Council on American Islamic Relations did not believe that, and is actually claiming that their headgear ban has been selectively enforced and that it's really just an Islamophobic exercise. And so they are suing this Islamophobic gun range. But the gun range, excuse me, is sticking to their guns, so to speak, and they say it saddens us that anyone would say we are not inclusive, given that we serve all races and religions every single day in all of our stores. We pride ourselves on this fact, and we strongly believe in America and the Second Amendment that is for every single American. The problem here is that CARE and this woman who is suing, they want to create special laws, special rules in gun ranges, on the job, in all manner of contexts, special arrangements for Muslims. And this is because in Sharia, in Islamic law, Muslims do have more rights and privileges than non-Muslims. Their lives are more valuable than non-Muslims. This is all laid out in Islamic law, as you know. So,
this is very similar to that story, and which we discussed previously, from years ago in New York, where a girl was told in New York that she couldn't ride a roller coaster wearing her headgear because if part of it goes off and gets caught on something, it would choke or behead her. So they have a rule: no headgear on there, no hats, no scarves, nothing. You can't have anything like that. And of course, it's a big uproar. The place is totally Islamophobic. And that young girl, by the way, that young girl who caused that uproar, by the way, was eventually killed by her own father in an honor killing. So as much as the focus was on the danger to this girl from the rules of the amusement park interfering with her religion, when they were the ones just trying to keep her safe, turns out there was a much greater danger there, namely her father, who killed her for not being Islamic enough. And so it's amazing how they keep missing. I mean, Robert, if this place had said, no Muslims allowed here at this range, no Muslims, we don't want any Muslims there, or something like that. If they'd said something like that, and CARE had stepped in and said, hey, we can't have that, I could see that. But it's the stories I always hear about are always, you look at the headline, oh, it sounds like discrimination, and you read the details and it's like, what? They have a general rule against headgear, and you're saying, no, this safety rule, which is meant for people not catching on fire or people not getting strangled to death on a roller coaster, you're saying that those safety rules should not apply to Muslims. And it's like,
they should have a special status.
Yeah.
Above
special.
Everybody else. That's right. And that's the whole idea. It's really a Sharia imperative, and nobody realizes that. It's also, of course, a very lucrative exercise, because generally if you can get the right kind of judge, they're very sympathetic to discrimination cases, and they can be quite remunerative for everybody involved. In any case, I wanted to mention before we go another story out of France, and that was a group of, actually a pair of young men who misunderstand Islam, and they actually videoed themselves torturing a dog. It's kind of a sickening video to watch, and they put it on Telegram, and we're very proud of it, and put happy face emojis by it and so on. And this, of course, is pure Sharia behavior, completely in line with traditions ascribed to Muhammad, in which he says Gabriel does not enter a house which contains a picture or a dog. 3 things annul the prayers, and that is prayers annulled by a dog, a donkey, or a woman. He ordered the killing of dogs except for hunting dogs and dogs used for security, and so on. This has led to a very low opinion of dogs in the Islamic world, and altogether too many stories like this of unfortunate dogs being mistreated by Muslims who believe that they are somehow unclean or even demonic.
Yeah, well, it's especially the black dog. Muhammad said the black dog is a devil.
Oh yeah.
And so, yeah, I have read lots of stories over the years in places like Spain and so on where dogs start getting poisoned in certain areas. People throwing them poisoned food.
That all comes out of the same imperative.
Mm-hmm.
France is actually quite a wonderful place these days if you're a jihadi. I have a story of a man yelling Allahu Akbar, and he riddled a parked car with bullets and then fled, encountered a female jogger on the way, told her to clear out or he would kill her, and she reported, as far as I know, I believe he might be still at large.
Well, at least they gave plenty of warnings. And
Indeed.
yeah.
Another man
See,
screaming.
that's progress, Robert. That's progress. Now they're warning you ahead of time. Hey, before I kill you, before I spray your car, let me spray this other car, and like I'll give you warnings ahead of time. So,
Yep.
we're heading in the right direction.
Another man, also in France, screaming Allahu Akbar, also pushed a man onto railroad train tracks, and of course was sent to a mental hospital because everybody knows that somebody who's yelling Allahu Akbar and doing violence is simply insane. There is no other possible explanation for such behavior, and there is no conceivable reason why anybody would do any kind of violence while screaming Allahu Akbar except insanity. So this fellow's in the mental hospital and all is well.
Yeah, it's weird how that insanity seems to spread.
It's a global outbreak, David.
Yeah, yeah, my goodness. And it's been going on for 14 centuries. It seemed to emerge someplace in Arabia.
And it's not even in the diagnostic and statistical manual. It's an incredible epidemic, of a pandemic, a global pandemic of mental illness.
That might be a good video. I'll find everyone who thinks it's a mental disorder, and I'll go through the entire 1,000-page diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. And why do they keep forgetting to list this?
Yeah, it's strange because probably there are more diagnosed instances of jihad as a mental illness than probably any other mental illness that is in the book. And so you got to wonder, why does it get short shrift from psychologists who really ought to be on the ball on this?
Oh, and by the way, you know what? Years ago, I made a video called "The Jihad Triangle," and it was meant as a response to the question: well, if Islam really teaches jihad, then why are there so many peaceful Muslims and Muslims who don't want to hurt people and so on? And I pointed out that jihad isn't just it isn't a product of one factor, one feature. It requires a few features, and one you have to believe in Islam. You have to believe in the Prophet that's calling for this. Two, you have to have some kind of accurate knowledge of what he taught about jihad. And three, you have to have the kind of right personality where you're not going to reinterpret that stuff to bring it in line with your other values and so on. And when you have those three things together, that's when you got a jihadi. But that is actually very similar to the common view of mental disorders now, where you have some sort of biological predisposition, but then environmental factors sort of activate it. And they find this out through like twin studies where one twin will have a disorder, but another twin won't, even though they have the exact same biological makeup. But what they find out is that having a twin with a mental disorder, all of a sudden your chances are now like 50% of having the mental disorder, whereas it's a very small percentage of the population who get it. You have a much greater chance if you have the correct biological makeup, but it's still some sort of other factors that sort of set you over the line. So you can think of like a cup, and let's say the top of this cup is the threshold for getting a mental disorder. Some people start with the cup already like half full. Just biologically, they're more prone. And so some things have to happen in life where they only have to be pushed a little so far before they get the mental disorder. Whereas other people, they start way down here. And this could be other things too. This could be like alcoholism or something, right? Some people have a few drinks and they become alcoholics. Some people can, drink regularly their entire lives. They never become alcoholics. And they have a low predisposition. And so they would have to be drinking tons every day in order to push them over the limit to alcoholism. Sure. Anyway, in that, jihad does sort of bear a resemblance to something like alcoholism in that some people you could teach them about jihad all day. They're just not going to go become jihadis. So they would have a sort of low predisposition. But you got some people who are naturally aggressive and so on. And so just got to give them a little nudge, and then they become jihadis.
I got one more, David. I think we're coming to the end here.
All right.
That is speaking of predisposition to jihad, I actually think this young man did not have a predisposition, but unfortunately, he had a jihadi brother. And of course, I'm referring to Jahar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. His brother Tamerlan was his older brother and his hero, and he followed him into jihad. They murdered 3 people and maimed many others with pressure cooker bombs at the Boston Marathon. And it has come out this week that he received a $1,400 COVID check from the U.S. government. And that's something that has been interesting to a lot of people. But I think that even more interesting is what came out in this story about the COVID payment, and that is that he has received over $21,000 from various people in the United States who apparently are just supporters.
Mm-hmm.
They like what he did. And I think that that's an extraordinary and revolting fact, but it's really not surprising. This is, after all, the jihadi who was on the cover of the Rolling Stone. The rock and roll magazine put him on the cover as if he were a rock star and making him look like one. And there were protesters outside when he made his first court appearance a few years ago with signs saying, "Free Jahar," and claiming that he'd gotten a raw deal from the law. Even though he has confessed and he's made it very clear that he did what he did for Allah and Islam. They claim that he's been mistreated by the American government. What they really mean is that they like how he looks and they think that he's kind of glamorous, and they've been conditioned to be very wary about Islamophobia and not at all concerned about jihad. And so they think he's a hero. And I think people of that kind of mindset are the ones sending him money these days.
Yeah, it reminds me of back when some of you are too young to remember a guy named Jeffrey Dahmer. But there was a guy named Jeffrey Dahmer. He killed and chopped up and ate something like 17 people. Had their body parts in his house and so on. And so he's a cannibal. And but there were all these just groupies running around his trial. And, oh, if I could just get to see Jeffrey and so on. They're writing him letters and so on. And anyway, it's somehow that was attractive to people. But you've got this guy, and what does he do? He's a lapdog for his big brother, who's a jihadi, and he joins in it, kills some people at a marathon, and suddenly he's a rock star. He's a rock star, cover of a Rolling Stone. So I mean, think about that message that sends, right? You want to be on the cover of the Rolling Stone, you got 2 ways. 1, become a huge rock star, or 2, go blow up some people.
Yep.
Either way.
It glamorizes, it's of course the glamorization of evil, and it's all of a piece with the Islamophobia imperative to stigmatize any opposition to jihad terror. Really, jihad terrorism, it's all our fault, David. You know that it's the fault of American imperialism. It's the fault of Islamophobia, and so on. And so there's just a relentless and ongoing, very skillful, I must admit, very skillful effort to take the attention, take the spotlight away from jihad activity altogether, and to focus it on some of the actual victims of the jihad activity as if they had provoked this. And this is it's an astonishingly successful propaganda effort, really, over the last 20-some years, really picking up after 9/11, that the victims of jihad violence primarily are Muslims, because there's an Islamophobic backlash after, and they were driven to it by Islamophobia before it happened. So it's all our fault, coming and going.
And you could even get $1,400 in COVID relief.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't get $1,400 in COVID relief.
Yeah.
But Jahar Tsarnaev did.
That's taxpayer money.
Yes, indeed.
Going into his prison canteen fund so that he can buy chips and ice cream.
$13,000 it said that he spent on himself. And I thought, what on earth could he possibly have spent does he have a jacuzzi in his cell? I mean, $13,000 is a good chunk of change. What's he spending it on in prison?
Yeah, you have I speak from experience here, but that would be a lot. I mean, that $13,000 is a lot. But yeah, you have your canteen fund where you can buy you can buy actual food that's not what they're serving you. So they're serving you like beans and rice one day, and you don't like beans and rice, so you can buy some ramen noodles and ice cream and a candy bar and some chips and stuff like that. And so he's I don't know the man, but I can tell you he's eating well. He's eating well in prison. He's eating better than I'm eating.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Special thanks to Robert for informing us about what's going on in the world that we are not hearing about from the regular media or from our politicians or from educators or from anyone else. And if you don't have Robert's book, there's a link in the description box, and always check out Robert's website if you want to stay up to date on the relentless jihad that's been coming for you for 14 centuries. And Robert, I have to say, I doubt we'll ever have another show again because they keep catching these jihadis. They keep catching these jihadis, and there has to be a finite number.
Well, we know that the imams of the world are out there right now working to correct this misunderstanding of Islam, and it's certain to vanish in the very near future.
Yeah. I mean, if everyone is speaking with a unified voice that Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance, and the books of Islam are so peaceful and tolerant, there's absolutely nowhere for jihadis to get the idea that Islam calls for the violent subjugation of the entire world. And so, since there's nowhere for them to get that idea, jihad is over. We can proclaim it right here on the final episode ever of This Week in Jihad.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Goodbye, everyone. You will never hear from us again. Robert, shut down your website right after we get off here.
You got it.